Good. I've been at the FIC Assembly this, it's called Bible Festival these past few days. Had a very exciting time there in Cheltenham. And if you were there, you would have been glad. If you weren't, well, I'm sorry that you missed it. And Don Carson was speaking on 2 Thessalonians, the whole of it, which is very difficult part of the scriptures to deal with, and I was worried that since I'm having to preach on the second coming today, I worried that I was going to have to get home late last night and completely start my preparation all over again. But fortunately, we didn't disagree too much on the end times. Well, we're in Mark chapter 13, and I heard a story about a group of people who were at a conference. I don't know if it was down in Bournemouth. I know that every year they still have prophetic witness and prophecy conferences down in Bournemouth. A whole group of people will come, they will take over a hotel, and someone will give them Bible teaching specifically on the subject of prophecy. And at one of these, there were 2 elderly ladies who had never been to anything like this in their life before. And they went, and they enjoyed it so much. And at the end of the first day, the man who was giving the evening talk spoke from 1 Corinthians 16, saying that when the early Christians, the first generation of Christians, met each other, they didn't say, as the Jews would say to each other, shalom, peace to you. They didn't say, as the Greeks would say to each other, kairein, joy to you. But they said, Maranatha. Come, Lord Jesus. And if you read 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 22, the Apostle Paul ending his letter in verse 21, he said, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Verse 22, if anyone does not love the Lord, a curse be on him. Come, Lord Jesus. There's the word Maranatha. And here were the early Christians, the speaker said, greeting each other. Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus. Well, these 2 sisters at this conference, they loved this. They went to sleep. They got up excited in the morning. They went to the speaker. They shook him by the hand and said, marijuana, brother, marijuana. Well, their heart was right, even if their understanding was wrong. And you know, in the Christian church, there are lots and lots of Christians whose heart is right about the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. But somewhere along the line, they've got confused. They've misunderstood things, and their mind is wrong. And we need to get our minds right on the subject of the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. The problem is that I don't think there are 2 Christians in the whole world who agree with each other on exactly everything. So I shall try and help us through some of the disagreements as we go along. But Hudson Taylor, who was a missionary in China, he has written in his diary a paragraph where he says the influence upon his life when he realized that Jesus Christ could come at any time, and that he had to always be prepared, always be ready, always be watching. And he said that revolutionized his Christian life. His whole attitude to every day was different, because this might be the day the Lord comes again. Campbell Morgan, who was the minister of Westminster Chapel at the first half of the last century, he writes the same things, that suddenly he was gripped by this truth that Jesus Christ's return was near. And it has such a profound impact, not only on his ministry, but on his personal life. And yet, so many people, when they hear for the first time that Jesus Christ is going to come again, that one day, the day will begin just like this. We will get out of bed, we will wash, we will clean our teeth, we will have our breakfast, but that day will not end, because Jesus Christ will come again. The trumpet of the Lord shall sound. We shall be caught up, and we shall be forever with the Lord. When people hear that for the first time, they think, it's a bit weird, isn't it? It's a bit strange. But as we understand the scriptures more, we realize this isn't weird. This isn't strange. It makes tremendous sense. Because Jesus Christ not only died upon the cross, not only was buried in the grave, not only rose from the dead, but he ascended bodily into heaven. And in the same way that he went, he will come again bodily from heaven. And it teaches us that we have a glorious hope. Our hope is not that when we die, our spirits kind of leave our bodies and float around in some happy, blissful heaven, and we have this ghostly experience. But no, Jesus Christ will come again physically, and our bodies will be raised physically, and we will be taken to glory physically, and we will have a relationship with God and with each other in the new heavens and the new earth, which is physical. We will touch, we will taste, we will smell. Hopefully smell nice. But it's going to be physical. This is our hope. Now, the Church of Jesus Christ down through the ages has had times where it has been so excited about the return of Jesus Christ, it seems to be the only message that they preached. And then it goes down into the depths and it forgets its hope completely. And what we've got to do is try and get the balance right. The registered Christians in China are forbidden to preach about the second coming of Jesus Christ. So the unregistered Christians major on it. And they've emphasized it so much, they've tended to have gone extreme on it. I was reading Robert Culver's Systematic Theology, and he was telling of a Baptist minister who from 1930 to 1955 preached only on the second coming of Jesus Christ. Well, his congregation would have known a lot about the second coming of Jesus Christ, but it'd be pretty unbalanced, wouldn't it? We've got to try and get the balance right. And that's why it's important that we preach systematically through the Scriptures. So we deal with each passage and we give each doctrine the same amount of emphasis that the Scriptures give to it. Did you know that the second coming of Jesus Christ is taught in the Scriptures? How much more do you think is taught than the first coming of Jesus Christ? Who thinks it's taught the same amount as the teaching of the first coming and the second coming of Jesus Christ? Who thinks that there's the same amount of teaching, prophecies about the first coming and second coming? Anyone? Who thinks there's twice as much prophecy about the second coming of Jesus Christ? 3 times as much? Okay. Who thinks there's 4 times as much teaching about the second coming of Jesus Christ in the Bible than there is about the first coming? Who thinks that? Anybody? Well, do you want to know what the answer is? It's 8 times as much. 8 times, which means if I preach on the first coming of Christ once at Christmas time, 1 week of the year, I should preach on the second coming of Jesus Christ every 6 weeks to give it the same amount of emphasis. Did you realize that? That's how important it is in the Scriptures. Well, we shall be looking at this subject as we go through Mark chapter 13 over the next few weeks. And I know I introduced it a couple of weeks ago, but what I want to do this morning is to lay the foundation for the next few weeks, so you'll know where we're going, and hopefully there will be less confusion. And I want to begin by looking at Mark chapter 13, verses 24 to 27, where we see what we agree on as Christians. What are the things where we all agree? The obvious teachings. These are what everybody understands. And if you look at verses 24 and 25, you see that the first thing we learn is that when Jesus Christ comes again, he's going to come in judgment. Mark 13, verse 24. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, men will see the Son of Man coming in clouds. You see, the second coming of Jesus Christ, although it is a day we look forward to, the day of the Lord in Scriptures is not just a day of hope and bliss. It is also a day of judgment and wrath. And when the Lord comes again, he comes to judge the world in righteousness. So if you read the last two paragraphs of Revelation chapter 6, if you read Revelation chapter 6 verses 12 to 17, you will find that this same story is fleshed out a little bit. And when the Lord Jesus Christ returns again, people will go and hide themselves. And they will hide themselves in caves, and they will call on the mountains, and they will call on the rocks to fall on them. They will pray for an earthquake. They will pray for the bridge to collapse upon them, to hide them from the wrath of the Lamb who sits upon the throne, because he comes to judge the world. Secondly, in Mark 13 and verse 26, in the beginning of verse 26, we read that the Lord Jesus Christ comes again visibly. At that time, men, that's men and women, will see the Son of Man coming in clouds. They will see, every eye will see him. Whether that will be because of some way that the Lord travels around the globe, or whether it will be because of something optical, or whether it be because of television, we don't know, but he will be seen. The Jehovah's Witnesses teach that Jesus Christ came in 1914 invisibly and nobody saw him. How they know he came, we don't know, but that's just not the biblical teaching. The biblical teaching is that the Son of Man comes visibly. Every eye will see him. In Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 28, the writer to the Hebrews says, as he appeared the first time to bear sin, so he will appear the second time. We will see him. He comes visibly. Thirdly, there at the end of verse 26 in Mark 13, he comes gloriously. Verse 26, at that time men will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. This is why they call on the mountains to fall on them and hide them from the face of him who sits upon the throne and the Lamb, because he comes in his glory. Don Carson this past week was speaking on 2 Thessalonians, and in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 it talks about the Lord Jesus Christ coming, and the lawless power that is opposed to him is destroyed by the breath of his mouth and the splendor, the glory of his appearing. It is so glorious that nothing can stand in his way. And then verse 27, he comes triumphantly. Verse 27, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven. He comes in power, in glory. His word is authoritative. His will is done. And he gathers his people to himself. And they're caught up to be with the Lord in the air. As the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 about the trumpet sounding. The Lord Jesus Christ comes again. This is our glorious hope. This is what we are looking forward to. And this is what Christians agree on. So let's move hesitantly to the second point, which is what Christians disagree about. And I've put down as a text for this Mark chapter 13 and verse 32, where Jesus says, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Isn't that interesting? No one knows about that day or how. No one knows exactly when Jesus Christ is going to come again. And so you would expect Christians just to accept that, wouldn't you? But we're very good at fighting amongst each other and saying, no, you've got it all wrong. I know it's going to be about this time. Now, there is a sense in which we have to wrestle with the scriptures and understand the prophecies, but we have to understand that there are mysteries here that nobody knows and nobody will be able to understand. But we don't leave it just like that. We tend to argue with each other, and there's a place for healthy debate. I'm not saying that we shouldn't argue about these things. What I'm trying to say is that we should recognize that there's disagreement, and we should be humble. There is a view of theology which says that Jesus Christ will come before 1,000 years of glory, a millennium. And Jesus Christ comes pre the millennium. C.H. Spurgeon held that view. There is a view that there's going to be great revivals and there's going to be 1,000 years of glory in the church, and then Jesus Christ will come after that millennium. This is the view that Jonathan Edwards, the greatest American theologian, held, and that Greg Haslam, minister of Westminster Chapel, used to hold this when I knew him at college. They say that Jesus Christ comes post the millennium. And there's a third view which says we're not looking forward to a literal millennium, that the millennium is just picture language for the church age, so there's going to be no millennium. And they are called amillennialists. And there are these different views as Christians disagree about these things. Now, I have to say that whatever your view on this is, it doesn't mean you're not a Christian. All right? If we were talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and some people said, well, Jesus Christ didn't rise, well, that means they're not Christians. You have to believe in the fundamentals to be a Christian. But to disagree about whether you're this millennium or that millennium is neither here nor there about your Christian life. You are a Christian. Indeed, you are an evangelical. Indeed, these different teachings are taught not only by evangelicals, but taught by very godly evangelicals. So holding a different view doesn't affect your godliness either. Not only are these different views held by Christians, by evangelical Christians, by godly evangelical Christians, but each different view is held by people who are very theologically astute. People who have, double PhDs in these subjects disagree with each other on the subject. So I think it teaches us that we have got to respect the other views of other people. Right? So you hold your view, and you can hold it as passionately as you like. But you must still respect that there are other godly, mature, Bible-believing, theologically trained Christians who disagree with you completely. So we've got to be respectful of other people's views. Indeed, I think we need to try and understand the other people's views. So don't just read your own view and shut out every other view and refuse to think about it because you've got your own little view and that's what you're sticking with. Try and understand. Be wise, be gracious to understand other people's views. And then don't be dogmatic about your own view. Don't get on your high horse and I'm right and everybody else is wrong. Because I promise you one thing, that you believe something today slightly different than what you believed 10 years ago. Your own view changes. So if you're going to be dogmatic that you are right, unfortunately in 10 years' time, you will have to be wrong then because you will disagree with yourself today because your views will develop. So let's not be dogmatic about our views, but let's learn to handle the controversial parts of this subject humbly. And that's what I want us to do, because I am convinced there is not one person in this congregation except for me who agrees with me on everything. All right? It doesn't matter who you are. We'll all disagree with each other on something. And in some places you'll be right. Surprise, surprise. In some places I'll be right. Even more surprise. So let's take this humbly together. But here's my outline of Mark 13, so you know roughly where we'll be going over the next few weeks. Verses 1 to 23 talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Then, in the rest of the chapter, verses 24 to 37, we have a sandwich about the second coming. It's a sandwich, and the middle bit, the food in the sandwich, is those verses that Marion Davis read to us about the fig tree. And verses 24 to 27, which we've just run through briefly a few minutes ago, teach us that the second coming is going to be after those days. So verses 1 to 23 are all about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So Jesus tells his disciples that the return of the Lord Jesus Christ could not be before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It had to be after those days. There were things that had to be fulfilled before the Lord could come again. So the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ is after those days of verses 1 to 23. Then the middle section of the sandwich, verses 28 to 31, teach us that everything necessary to be done before the Lord Jesus Christ returns would take place in that generation when Jesus was alive. He says there in verse 31, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. All these things necessary to be done before the Lord Jesus Christ will return would be done in that one generation. And then he hammers it home, verse 32, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. I tell you the truth, this is certainly true. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. All these things shall happen in this generation. So everything necessary to be done before Jesus Christ would return would be done in that generation. And then the sandwich ends, verses 32 to 37. It was saying that although we know when everything will be fulfilled before the Lord could come again, no one knows when the Lord will come again after that time. So we always have to be prepared. We know what will happen in this generation, but verse 32, no one knows the timing of the Lord's return. Now I think this outline is quite helpful because it balances this section which began in chapter 11 with the cleansing of the temple, and we had there a fig tree sandwich, one story, then two stories around the fig tree, and the same here in chapter 13. So it balances the structure of the book. But I think this is helpful because it always also explains why does Jesus Christ say so much about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and then suddenly jump to the return of Jesus Christ? You know, what's the connection? And the connection is that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70 was the last thing that had to happen before the Lord could return. Therefore, Jesus Christ is near. Do you remember I told you about the bird flying over the lake? There was the Lord in the distance. And then the bird flies, and then it's hovering just across the surface of the lake. And at any time, the bird can dive in to the lake. Well, the Lord Jesus Christ has been coming, and then from AD 70, his coming is near. The judge is at the door. And at any time, we don't know when, but at any time, he can just break into history. The Lord is near. James says, the judge is at the door. He's there. We should be waiting. We should be watching. He's near. He can come today. We must be prepared for the imminent return of Jesus Christ. Well, that's how I will outline this passage. At least that's how I plan to deal with this chapter. Now, there are difficulties with this view. I'm not going to say this is everybody else who disagrees with me are ignorant. There are difficulties with this view, and we should try to deal with them humbly as we proceed through Mark 13 in future weeks. But it makes sense of the command to watch. Look at verse 33. Be on guard. Be alert. You do not know when that time will come. Verse 35. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back. Verse 37. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. There's the emphasis. Jesus is saying, watch. Be prepared. Be alert. Be on your guard. Are you ready today? So there are the controversial areas, and telling you how I'm going to try and walk through that minefield. But I don't want to end on a controversial note. So I want to end on a very positive note of how should this affect us? How should this apply to our lives? And this is why I asked Marion Davis to read that very long reading from Matthew chapter 24 all the way through to the end of Matthew chapter 25. If when you go home you want to read Matthew chapter 24 and verses 1 to 41, you will find it is almost exactly the same word for word as Mark 13. It's the same message, except when Matthew gets to where Mark ends, Matthew then throws in parable after parable after parable after parable. Story to explain it, story to explain the application, story to hammer it home. And we have these 5 parables, one after another, from Jesus Christ, hammering home the message. And I thought it would be nice to spend 5 minutes, that gives me 1 minute on each of these parables, to hammer home the application of the sermon that Jesus Christ has just given. And so if you look at Matthew chapter 24, verses 42 to 44, you will see that Jesus says, first of all, that the Son of Man will come like, what does he say, like a thief in the night. Now that doesn't mean he's coming as a bad person, of course not. God forbid that we should even think that. It means he's coming unexpectedly. It's going to be a surprise. If you read Luke chapter 21 and verse 34, when Jesus is giving this same sermon, and it's reported by Luke, he ends, Jesus says, you need to be prepared, for the Son of Man will come at a time when you don't expect him. And there are lots of people who say, oh, he can't come today, he can't come today. We're not expecting him today. Well, be on your guard, because that's the kind of time he's going to come. Robert Murray McCheyne was a young preacher in Scotland in the he died in about 1831, 32, so before then. And he belonged to a group of young ministers who would meet together to study the New Testament in Greek, and they called themselves the Eclectic Society. And they would meet together, and some of them got really extreme views on the second coming of Jesus Christ. So McCheyne asked one of them, he said, do you think that Jesus Christ could come tonight? He said, no. Went to the next one. Do you think Jesus Christ could come tonight? No. The next one, same question, same answer, all around everybody in the room. They all said no, because of their view on prophecy, Jesus Christ couldn't come tonight. And then McCheyne opened up Luke 21, verse 34. At a time when you do not expect him, he will come. He comes like a thief in the night, a time when we don't expect him. So we've got to have the right attitude in our mind. We've got to be watching all the time. You know, in your house you have the smoke alarm that is on all the time. Well, in your mind you have to have that watchfulness. The Lord could come at any time. It's always there in your mind. Parable number 2, Matthew 24, verses 45 to 51. The master puts his servants in charge of the house, gives them jobs to do, and he goes away. And the servant says, oh, he's not coming back, and starts abusing the other servants. And when the master returns and finds him behaving badly, that poor servant gets it in the neck. And it's a lesson to us that we've got to be working. When we're watching for the return of Jesus Christ, it's not like we're at the seaside lazing back, watching the clouds pass by. It's not that kind of watching. Watching for the return of Jesus Christ means that we are working, and it means that we are relating well with the others that Jesus Christ has put in his household. You should be relating well to each other. My father died in tragic circumstances when I was about 13 or 14. I had a brother a couple of years older than me, and the death of my father had a terrible impact upon his life. And for about 1.5 years, he didn't talk to me, didn't talk to anyone in my family. He would come in, go up into his bedroom and shut the door. My mum would have to take him his food and give it to him, and he would eat it in his bedroom. And then he would come out, go to school in the morning, come back, shut himself in his room. Didn't talk to anyone. His birthdays, Christmas, had no contact with us at all. He was part of the family, but he was living as if he wasn't part of the family. And Jesus is saying there are some people, who are put in the family, and they're meant to be part of the family, but they're living as if they're not part of the family. Indeed, they're grumbling, criticizing, hurting, injuring others. That is unacceptable, because the master who's put us in his household with jobs to do is going to come again and ask how we're getting on. So we've got to have the right attitude in our wills, not only in our minds with watching, but in our wills working. And then the third parable, chapter 25, verses 1 to 13, is the parable of the bridegroom. Here's the 10 virgins, and they're waiting for the bridegroom to come. And as those of you who were at my daughter's wedding last week knew that she was about a quarter of an hour late, well, I have been taking a wedding in India, and we waited quarter of an hour for the bride to come, and then we waited half an hour, and they had made me wear my shirt and tie and my dark trousers and my shoes and socks, while all of them were just in sandals and something light, and I was sweating away in the heat of the under the Indian sun, and we waited 45 minutes for her to come, and then an hour, and then an hour and a half, and after an hour and 45 minutes she came. But we were waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and almost dying, but she came. And in those cultures where they don't have wristwatches, alarm clocks, and other things, your timing isn't so exact. And here in the Middle East, it wasn't the bride who came, but it was the bridegroom who would come with all his friends. And you weren't quite sure when they were going to come. You just knew that they were going to come sometime. And so you had to be holding on for the long wait. And that's what Jesus Christ is saying here. We've got to have an attitude in our hearts that we are going to persevere, that we're going to wait, that we're going to hold on. We're not going to give up waiting for the Lord Jesus Christ to return and concentrate on other things. We're not going to go away and do some shopping. We're waiting, and we're holding on, and we're looking for him to return. And then the fourth parable there in chapter 25, verses 14 to 30, is the illustration not of the thief or the master or the bridegroom, but here is the managing director who has called his workers together, and he's given them all some talents, and he's expecting them not only to work, but to make progress in their Christian lives, to use the talents they've got and develop them, so that when he comes again, they're not merely going to have them, but they'll have done something with the talents that they were given. And so he gives these people their talents, and some of them, they do really well, but one just buries it. And when the managing director returns, well, he's pleased with some, but angry with the others. And we have to recognize the gifts that God has given us, not just to have, not just to use, but to develop. Our progress must be evident to all. We, as we get older in the Christian life, should be accomplishing more, praying more, serving more, teaching more, encouraging more, discipling more, mentoring more, loving more, forgiving more, encouraging more. Because soon the managing director will return and say, look at the talents you've got. Have you been multiplying them? And then the fifth and final and very sober parable, 25 verses 31 to 46. The Son of Man returns like a shepherd who sees the flock mingling with sheep and goats. And he gets the goats and pushes them away and separates the sheep for himself. And we have to ask ourselves, are we sheep in his fold? So that when he comes and separates the goats from the sheep, we're going to be the sheep in his fold. And how do we recognize sheep? Well, here the parable shows us it's not simply that we use our talents to serve our managing director, but that we use our talents to serve the other sheep. To the least of these, his brothers, we give a glass of cold water. We give them a visit. We encourage them. We don't separate ourselves and live in our little castles and hide ourselves away from all God's people so that people with problems, well, someone else can deal with them, but we're not going to deal with them. That's the attitude of goats. The attitude of sheep is that he's our shepherd. We're his flock. And we love one another sincerely. We care for one another. And we encourage each other. And do you know how we encourage each other? We go up to them and we say, Maranatha, brother. Come, Lord Jesus. It may be tonight. It may be tomorrow. It might not be for 1,000 years. But we're ready. And soon, and very soon, we're going to see the King. Let's sing that together.